Conway Hall, London, where ethics matter.
Good evening and welcome to Conway Hall, where ethics matter. We are a hub for free speech and independent thought in London, and now we've got a YouTube channel and are transmitting to everybody worldwide too. Tonight, we've got ethical matters, overtime, why we need a shorter working week. We'll be looking at the book Overview, which will be published tomorrow, and we'll be considering the time we spend at work is neither natural nor inevitable. This book explains what a shorter working week means, as well as its history and its political implications. Joining me this evening are the writers of the book. Kyle Lewis, who is Associate Lecturer in Health and Social Sciences Department at the University of the West of England. And we have Will Stronge, who is a researcher in politics and philosophy at the University of Brighton. They are both co-directors of Autonomy, a think tank. This evening also we have Brett from the independent bookstore to sell copies of the book, so we hope to sell a couple of copies at least, otherwise he has to go all the way home carrying them on his back. We're going through Zoom, so please do store up all of your questions because I'll be able to ask them on your behalf later on. So let's start with the subject. All right, we work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. It's always been like that. No big deal. What's the problem?
Well, so I think the argument we make in the book is that, I mean, first of all, it's recognizing that, as you said in your introduction, the way that we work and how long we work for has been historically constructed. So it's, as humans, there's nothing necessarily natural about working 5 days a week, 40 hours a week, and having a weekend as a break. We can point to things such as, hunter-gatherer societies. There's a great book by James Sussman called Work, which is, he's an anthropologist who studies the history of humanity, but also tribes in Africa and other indigenous peoples. And he shows very clearly that the average amount of time spent doing necessary things to eat and to kind of all the necessary tasks of what it is to live didn't amount to more than 15 hours a week for certain hunter-gatherer societies. So we can even point to historical moments where we didn't work as much as we do now. And I think even closer to home, we should recognize that we used to work 7-day weeks, 6-day weeks until relatively recently. So around 80 years ago, just after World War II, when we kind of normalized the 5-day week. That's the first thing to recognize, that actually, and we should understand that the way that we work is something which we can change and has changed in the past. Now, I'll touch on one point. I'll let Carl jump in on other reasons why. The reasons why we think it's important to change the way we work is multiple, really. There's a number of good reasons why we think we should shorten the working week, why this is no longer working, and we can go into perhaps some of the details of these. But I think one reason I want to mention is burnout, is our mental health, basically. I think it's a very good thing the last 10, 20 years we've been having a growing conversation about mental health. But I think it's not talked about enough that, for example, over 50% of sick days in the UK are due to work-related stress, anxiety, depression. These are kind of days, this is not good necessarily, it's not good for us, but it's also not good for business either. So recognizing that mental health epidemic, some people are calling it, is one reason why we think we should work less, have more time for relaxation, more time for recuperation. But there's multiple reasons which we can go into, but I'll let Carl.
Sorry. I was just going to say, so that's interesting because in the book you write, working time has always been a political matter regarding the distribution of power and wealth in society. So what we have now is not automatic.
Exactly, and I think there is a kind of common sense view that the working week that we have and the free time we have off, and especially the weekend, it has always been that way. But as we tried to point out in the book, it hasn't. And these have the free time that we have, whether that's a weekend, whether that's maternity leave, paid sick leave, these kind of things. These have been won through workers and through worker struggles, wanting kind of a freedom from work. There's obviously desires to have certain freedoms in work, whether that's increase in pay, etc. But there's also been this desire to be free from the kind of burdens of work as well. And so, yeah.
Can you take us through then the key, say from the sort of Industrial Revolution onwards, I suppose, which is when our work, our new form of work started to be formed. Can you take us through a couple of the key points at which work was renegotiated? Mm-hmm. And I suppose we need to stick to the Anglosphere and to Europe, because there are so many ways of working throughout the world, and it would take forever to go through them all.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think there's a few key moments. I mean, there's some really amazing texts out there which kind of document some amazing historical episodes of this. I think, the first thing we should mention, which is quite a useful reference point, is obviously there's a chapter in Karl Marx's Capital where he talks about the fight for the 10-hour day, which is happening in England in the 19th century, where workers were basically saying, look, we want to reduce the working day from 11 hours to 10 hours. There's huge pushback from employers, but ultimately, due to their arguments around basically the conditions in the factories, the fact that workers are quitting because they simply can't deal with that amount of work and so on, that was achieved, a 10-hour day, and Marx uses that as an example of, look, we can actually have and win tangible benefits for people in the workplace. Two others I'll mention, I don't know if it has any, which I might have missed, which are quite nice. In America, there's a really interesting history of the fight for shorter working hours, which coincides with debates around during the Civil War and after the Civil War. So arguments against slavery were also dovetailing with arguments against what they used to call wage slavery. It wasn't that long ago, it was about 100 years ago, that people were casually throwing around the term wage slavery, what now we call employment. So we have this kind of growing conversation and fights for shorter working hours in America right through the Civil War, after the Civil War. And there's some great little snippets. There's some nice stories of, for example, employers in the most part were the ones with watches, basically. People couldn't afford timepieces. So employers were the only ones who could really say when the end of the day was, and they started to extend the day by half an hour by saying, oh no, we're not quite finished yet, just like cheekily adding extra time on. And the workers kind of got wind of this and would basically, they raised cash in one instance, I think it was in Michigan, but I'm not sure. I can't remember exactly. They basically raised cash to build a giant clock in the centre of town and said, that's the time, and we're not going to work any further than that particular time, because that's the time we're contracted for, to try and, it's literally a physical battle over time, as it were. And then the final one I'll mention, which I think is just before the 20th century, and Carl will be able to maybe mention a few in the 20th century, but one I think is really, really important is the battle that the stonemasons in Australia had in the late 1800s, where effectively they were demanding the 8-hour day. And they're the first collective of workers who won the 8-hour day in Melbourne, and they effectively marched down the street, had a giant banquet as a kind of like tools down, we're not going to work any more than this. And ultimately they achieved it, and Australia's Labour Day is based off that one particular day where the workers won the 8-hour day. So they were really ahead of the game. That was like way before the 20th century in the UK and the US. So I think there's all these. It's always been part of the struggles of workers. It's a struggle for freedom, really, and that was quite common sense. I think we've lost that a little bit, but that was really part of the common sense.
And I think something else to mention is that we have seen the kind of biggest reductions in working time, the amount we work, usually after a kind of crisis. So after the First World War in 1918. So I think it was in 1919 we saw in the UK the biggest reduction in working time. So it was at a time when union membership was strong, and collective bargaining was strong as well. And obviously coming out of the horrors of the First World War, there was a sense in which, a political sense in which we need to give back. So the average working week from 1919 reduced from nearly 60 hours down to, I think it was 48 hours. So it's a huge reduction. And again, it's pointed to, and historically it's kind of looked back on as a massive win for the labour movement. And it formed a huge part of trade union and the labour struggle and working time was right at the kind of sometimes above actually increase in pay. And again, as Will kind of mentioned, that's slightly been lost today. We are seeing, we'll maybe touch on it in a bit, we are seeing the re-emergence of the labour movement, trade union movements having this at the forefront again. But for quite a long period, it did kind of fall off the kind of the list of demands that were being put forward.
It strikes me that in a modern workforce, the workforce is probably more fractured than it was previously. In the eras that you're talking about, there were enormous and powerful employers, so you could have collective bargaining and you could have trade unions who did have clout. So that possibly makes a difference to the kind of clout that workers have now. Are there other factors too?
Yeah, I think you're right. The fracturing of workforces, particularly spatially as well. So it's not exactly. I mean, now we do still have huge employers, but often they're atomized spatially. So Amazon or let's say even things like Uber and so on. They have huge workforces, but they are spread out. So spatially, that's a problem as well as monopolized firms. I mean, perhaps we're moving back to a more monopolized labour market, as it were, as the kind of mid-level of firms seem to be dropping off and not really standing the heat against the big Amazons and so on. I think there's an interesting muddying of the waters that happened somewhere in the 80s and 90s around flexibility. And I think there's in the book we mention flexibility as a kind of ambiguous kind of benefit in a way, where the benefits of flexibility, working when you want, where you want, as well as allowing to kind of fit work around some of your lifestyle. That's the kind of the sell of flexibility. That's something which was taken up more and more in the 80s and 90s by trade unions, and less. And the idea of shorter working hours did kind of fall back a little bit. I mean, at the same time, we've got to remember that this is when the trade union movement was in decline in terms of its power and so on. So I think that there's a tendency to kind of conflate flexibility per se with the shorter working hours demand, and I think that means that those two things are quite distinct. And then during the COVID period, I think we should be very clear about what that is: reducing work versus just the flexibilization of work. And I think that is that conversation, unfortunately, kind of became less about the 35-hour week, which was a conversation happening in the late 80s, and more about allowing for flexibility in how you work. And so I wouldn't say it's the main determinant. You already touched on perhaps one of the main determinants, but I think it is important.
Okay. Is there an evidence that we as the proles have sort of internalized this as a value as well, that this is a virtue to get these attainments to work this hard?
No, definitely. I think there's a strong kind of work ethic that runs through working class communities. I remember growing up, basically the aspirations that my mum and dad had first and foremost was that I got a job and I worked hard. That was the benchmark. If you do that, then you can have a good life. You can get yourself a house. You can have a family. You can live a decent life, because that's what they did. That's what their grandparents did. But unfortunately, we're kind of seeing the kind of diminishing returns, as it were, of hard work in society nowadays. Whereas, having a decent job doesn't necessarily entail the kind of conditions that it once did in terms of pay, and having access to, say, a decent house and being able to have that disposable income. So I think we're starting to see now that kind of, for the kind of millennial generation and below, that kind of questioning of the work ethic. Because if I am slaving away and I'm working hard, I'm committing my life to this, but I can't get on the property ladder and I can't have these things that my parents have, then what's the point a little bit? So I think that's been part of the conversation that's driving working time again is around the kind of diminishing returns of hard work.
I think there's something. I think I agree with all of that, and I think the work ethic takes different forms in different historical periods, and I think the one which we're most bombarded with today is the kind of entrepreneurial spirit. You kind of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, but in a way which is not the same as kind of I can provide for myself and my family. It's more I can start my own business. I can sell. I might be a streamer online. I might sell my own products and so on. As a kind of what some you might call the neoliberal individual. I think that's the kind of self-made person that we're told, and I think companies like Fiverr and others who say, I'm a gig worker, and they kind of use it as a bit of a value in itself. That's the work ethic today. I think it's less about the hard physical graft. It's more about self-promotion, the personality, and so on. which if you've made it, it's because of your own hard graft rather than whatever, fortuitous circumstance and so on. So I think that there's new forms of work ethic bombarding us, but there's also, as Carl said, reasons why this has less and less traction, because it's simply not viable for most people.
It's becoming apparent that luck really is, a large part of the formula.
Yeah, parents are. Yeah.
Well, yes, and look at the magnificent fortunes that were built in the past. I mean, with technology, you've got this growth of railways, the growth of canals, the growth of microchips and things, and all those people worked very hard, but they had to be in the right place at the right time to take advantage of it. So work alone is not the only thing. So if we go back to an earlier era, say the mid-20th century, where work did pay off a bit more, if basically we didn't need to work as hard to provide everything, if you could just provide the basics, why did people work more than that?
I mean, so in that period from let's say, up until basically about 1980, the working week was reducing on average, and so we've flatlined since then. But the mid-20th century, the time of Fordist industrialism, the time of let's say probably the golden age of capitalism in terms of the sheer amount of people benefiting from it, that was a time when the working week was being reduced significantly. And I think that was also the time where, you're right, we had, let's say, a more generous welfare state, more prosperity, this particularly in the global north, of course. And people felt like this really was going to happen. There really was, the idea of the leisure society was on the minds of many people, from Martin Luther King through to, slightly before his time, people like Bertrand Russell, where they were, and Keynes. They're all grappling with, how are we going to deal with, the trajectory we're on? We've moved from, the start of the century, 60-hour weeks, and now we're around 44 hours. If we keep going, we're going to have to think about what we're going to do. And so it really was a moment where capitalism seemed to be ticking over quite nicely for some, but for a great many in the global north. And it looked like we're on the cusp, and that's why, presidents were, Nixon was talking about, let's create a commission for thinking about how we're going to deal with this new free time and automation and so on. And so in some sense, it's quite a utopian moment. At the same time, infused in this kind of this economic moment, you also have obviously hugely much greater patriarchal relations than we have now. So still the male breadwinner model. Women were still expected to be at home looking after the kids, and the men went to work. The work itself was quite monotonous and quite boring. And so in some sense, factory work effectively that was widespread in the global north. And so at the same time, being quite a utopian moment, is also a moment of great racial segregation and so on. So sorry, that's slightly by the by, but I think there was in some sense an expectation that this trajectory would keep going, and that was because of the strength of the labour movement at the same time. Now, why that stopped is for multiple reasons that we can talk about, but I think there was, looking back now from our perspective, it's almost as if some of the material benefits of that time, particularly, obviously, two white guys, it probably would have been one of the best times, but it's almost like about rekindling that spirit where you'd put work, which might be monotonous and boring, in its place, and let's reinstill that expectation that we should have an economy where we can have free time, where people can lead good lives, and that's the purpose of the economy. The fact that ideology slipped and became slightly more about self-made entrepreneurialism, that I see as a negative thing.
Yeah. No, I don't. I think you covered all bases.
What about, it's been observed by lots of people, Keynes included, that people have to work a certain amount to feed themselves and stop the rain, keep the rain off them at nights. Aside from that, we do like to spend money on other things, and those other things quite often associated with hierarchical urges within us. We want to have things, we want to show things off. Is that something that we can kind of get rid of or deal with differently in human nature? Is it just our setup at the moment that brings that out so in such an ugly fashion?
I think there is something about that. I mean, for the very fact that we call disposable income disposable, that is something that we just need to instantly get rid of. So I do think there's something in the very fact that we have a kind of we have production, and that we basically have to sell our labour in order to then and then through doing that we have enough money then to purchase the things that we need, that, you know, that does create a kind of mindset where it's not necessarily about the things that you do, it's about the purchasing power that you have. So I do think if maybe there was an emphasis on creating, you know, an economic system in which it wasn't necessarily about, you know, the constant need to create profit, and the need to, you know, always being in that kind of realm of necessity, you know, because the very fact that if you lose your job, you know, straight away you're in that precarious moment. So I think if we had a society in which you didn't have that necessity in a most basic sense was taken care of, I do think it would create a very different relationship to the things that we own, and having that free time to learn skills, to do things for yourself. You know, it would be a change in mindset. I believe.
I remember reading an account from an anthropologist who worked in Haiti for a while, and he went out into the countryside. The difference in the countryside and the cities there is very pronounced in sort of not just physical possessions, but in the way that people operate. And he complimented a guy on his house, and the guy just rebuffed the compliment. You know, it's just, oh, it's no big deal. It's not, oh yeah, I repaired it last week, it's leaking. So, and he finally got to the bottom of it, was that it was gauche for this guy to say, yes, I've got a big marvellous house, and look at my poor neighbours over there, because what they had embedded, and most pre-industrial societies have this, is that there was embedded in there that if somebody had got something more than somebody else had got, then they were nicking it from somewhere. You know, they had done something underhand to get it, because people were working at a uniform rate and their work paid in an equal sense. And so you would be gauche if you would show off about something. You'd get accused of, you know, being immoral.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting, because this is not the same thing, but you do see, and maybe this is the sign of our political times, you also see a trend of, let's say, the very rich dressing down to kind of look like the everyman today. And that's very different, because to some extent they're just hiding, compared to the actual unethical system, which is baked in, where it's a shared understanding. But I think there's definitely a, you know, while there's an aspirational culture 100%, there's also a kind of awareness that actually most people who are very rich probably didn't work to get to that state. There's a lot of inheritance going on. There's a lot of got a lot of luck, and so I think there's almost, and it kind of forcing a kind of casualization of it might be very expensive, but it looks inexpensive. That's an interesting cultural shift, I think. Whereas, you know, I think in different areas there would be a kind of visually a very sharp distinction between the elite and everyone else. But I mean, perhaps that's not really important.
I think it is, though, because they're living in a culture where, at the same time, women of far lower income could gang together, and between 5 or 6 of them, they could buy a designer handbag, and each take it in turns to go out with it. So you have somebody who doesn't have access to as much capital trying to look as though they do, and somebody who doesn't trying to look cool by not, you know, showing off how wealthy they are.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, consumerism, obviously, particularly in the 20th century, was and provoking people to be consumers and dispose of their income. It was basically part of the old economic model, wasn't it? I mean, that's that for decades. That was we need people, and we still do need people to buy stuff and accumulate stuff in order to keep that churn going. As Carl says, increasingly many things are just becoming out of reach. I mean, I think there's also a conversation, obviously, to be had around consumption in the environment. I mean, we're at Autonomy, we're carrying out a study at the moment around who are the major emitters in terms of income groups around the world, basically, and who are in the top 1% of carbon emitters, basically those who are flying everywhere. You couple that kind of study, like which sections of society, you couple that kind of study with some of my favourite studies of deprivation, which are around, you know, interesting discussions around which items and which activities does the population feel are necessary for a decent standard of life, a non-deprived life. And there's things like being able to go to a birthday party, being able to have a winter coat, having 3 meals a day, and so on. You think about those two different kind of conversations, one about the high emitters, the high income emitters, and others who are just the consumption that the consumption basket that we think we all need is relatively modest. And so I think the conversation around a society where we're accumulating, we're provoked to accumulate and consume. Actually, most people think for a decent life, there's actually a modest set, and if we can achieve that, then I think that shifts the conversation around consumerism, because actually some of my favourite things to do, and I think a lot of people's favourite things to do, is to spend time with other people, and that might include the pub, absolutely, but it wouldn't necessarily include just buying loads of stuff. I think often that's a lot of therapy we do to ourselves.
Yes.
Sorry,
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And who are, all right, so what are these behaviours then? If we've established that most of us can do most of the things we like and it doesn't cause a great deal of environmental damage, who are the people who are really damaging the environment with what they're doing?
It's the top 10 and then 1%, basically. I mean, like, these are preliminary findings, but we're looking at, effectively huge, almost rivaling the bottom 60% of populations in different countries around the world, that the top 10 and sometimes 1% are emitting almost as much as the bottom 50 and 60% in many cases. And that kind of makes sense though, right? In a way that, like, fine, we buy ready meals and water bottles and so on, so our carbon footprint is being expanded, but that's nothing compared to the amount of the flights, of the super rich, basically. But, and this is an interesting conversation because we've done studies on the carbon footprint of work, of production, but actually it's the consumption around work that's also really, really bad for the environment. So that's why the environmental argument that Carl was alluding to earlier is really important, that actually shortening the working week can mean reducing a lot of the consumption. So commuting, for example, a lot of people in this country commute by car. And obviously that's really bad for the environment. And so water bottles, ready meals, all the kind of, I'm sure we've all done it, right? Like you're instead of cooking for yourself, you rush out and buy a prep, or because you've got to get to work, or you're rushing to the station, but you want some water, get a bottle of water. So that kind of consumption basket that we have, that's one of the arguments for a shorter working week. If you reduce the working week by 20%, you're also taking many, many cars off the road. And actually, there are some decent studies in the last couple of years that say that. So I'm talking a lot. I feel like, sorry.
All right. So we reduce the working week by 20%. Surely the world implodes.
Wow. The world didn't implode when we moved from a 6-day week to a 5-day week, over the course of the 20th century. It's very interesting when we look at a lot of the arguments against say, a 4-day week now. They're very similar arguments that were being made, back at the beginning of the 20th century, why we shouldn't move to a 5-day week. That you can have this huge drop-off in productivity, it's going to make people lazy, that we're not going to be able to compete in an international market. But that didn't bear out at all, So I think basically, and with these things, Will and myself have worked with companies. We've helped them basically trial a shorter working week. So some companies have basically moved from maybe working 36, 37-hour weeks, and they've trialed a 4-day week, moving down to anywhere between kind of 28 to 32 hours. And, they've done that for 6 months, for a year, and, they've had amazing results. Productivity's increased, they've still kind of hit their targets, workers are more rested. So it's actually, and it's become something that they've massively embraced as a company. They kind of look at the ways in which there's dead zones or times when they're not productive as a workforce, and so basically reassessing how you work, you start finding those kind of productivity increases from it. So the kind of trials that have happened around the world from first-hand experience, but also more kind of the empirical studies that have happened on larger scales are showing that if anything, it doesn't have a detrimental impact, it has a very, very positive impact.
Well, that's very good to know, because I think that would probably be most people's go-to worry, would be that the economy would contract and we'd all be poorer and more unstable.
Just on that point, I think that Carl raises a nice distinction there, but also between successful trials, companies pursuing it, and then the question of as to whether national economies can do it. And actually, what you just said then, basically, like, effectively, we do live in a poor economy. We have the most stagnant wage growth there has been since the Napoleonic Wars. We have a low wage economy which doesn't invest in new technologies. And this is one argument for the shorter working week, is if you start shortening the working week, employers start finding ways to make up what they perceive as productivity losses. In many cases, that won't be the case. You invest in new technologies. That's how there's this kind of two-step between, okay, human labor, sometimes if it becomes more expensive, you invest in machines. We live in a low-wage economy, people aren't investing in machines. You start shortening the working week, there's a certain deficit of labor at a national level. To some extent that's made up by productivity gains, but in some cases not. You both have a lot more employment in terms of more jobs being created, but also investment in technology. So there's actually an argument to say that economies will benefit from there being tighter labor markets, better well-being, increasing productivity of human labor, but also more investment in machines. So we're in a bit of a quandary at the moment, and the shorter working week is one way of actually stimulating change in the economy by kind of introducing that. So I think that's...
Yeah, and also as well, we have a very kind of polarised workforce. On the one scale, we have people who are underemployed, who struggle to get enough hours and be able to make ends meet. So have this, have a kind of temporal forms of inequality. And then on the other end, we have people that are overworked, in their jobs, where there's a culture in which you have to be on all the time. So again, by shortening the working week, you attempt to address both those things and think about how time can be more equally redistributed across the economy. And of course it's not going to happen overnight, and there could always be ways it could be improved and distributed more equally. But that's the premise, and I think that's something we should kind of move towards and recognise there are those two ends. People that are underemployed and overemployed, and how we can address both. And the shorter working week, I think, is a good start.
One category of person I can think who is drastically overemployed are women with children, because they're usually working these days. You don't have many stay-at-home mums, and they're also looking after children and usually doing more than 50% of the housework as well.
Absolutely.
How would this feed into their situation?
Yeah, so in the book we do actually. You take the
Yeah, so in the book we address this, and we say that the shorter working week is a feminist issue. And it very much would attempt to address gender inequality that exists in our society. So, from when we look at the fact, like you say, a vast majority of the work that goes on in the household is carried out by women. And then the kind of repercussions of that are how it affects then the labour market, when we find that especially women returning to the labour market are often have some of the most precarious forms of employment. Women, I think it's over 50% of, 60% of people on zero-hour contracts are women. So you find basically it's from both sides then that women are affected by this. So it attempts to kind of address both, really. I mean, it's not going to happen without a cultural shift. Just by shortening the working week alone isn't going to, in one foul swoop,
make men
pull the weight. But it will need a culture shift. But at least it kind of is. That's the premise of it. It hopefully would create the conditions in which, again, domestic work could be equally shared among the genders.
Further eroding that kind of male breadwinner idea, even if it's not even the case anymore. As you say, female participation rates are much higher now, but they're still burdened with that work. I think the point which also we allude to in the book as well is that the roles which are heavily have huge female participation, things like caring and teaching, for example, are just like huge burnout in these sectors. So it's about, as Carl was saying, it's that doubly kind of getting saddled with this work, whether you're working from home and having a job, or you're in roles which are basically some of the most stressful in the economy. So the shorter working week is perhaps most beneficial to women for those two reasons.
I remember hearing once that somebody said that the biggest effect of the Feminist Revolution of the 60s and 70s was that men thought they did more housework than they thought they did before. So, so this would, perhaps this would help with this. And I do know a couple of teachers who are dealing with very small kids, and small kids are a handful, but they love the kids, they can't stand all the paperwork. There's more training days, more meetings, more. If somehow the job has ballooned, and it's not contact with the children.
No, exactly. I mean, we've actually, funnily enough, we've done some polling, which is coming out soon, around, what of teachers, what's the favourite part of the day, what's the least favourite part of the day, meetings, admin, marking versus supporting parents and families, spending time with children and so on. It's a really interesting mix. Trying to really isolate what's from an employee perspective, what's the most valuable time, and I think that's something we could all do with our jobs, to be honest. Actually, like, what time do we enjoy the most, and what time do we think is perhaps an unnecessary burden?
Yeah. I think this is a difficult one, because we, you meet someone for the first time. Hello, I'm whoever. And what do you do? We've internalised it to the point where it's a sense of our identity.
No, completely. I mean, yeah, it's. But I mean, interestingly, that's how how Will and myself kind of got into the policy world was coming from a world of academia where we were precariously employed. We kind of we were both we were in that situation of being underemployed, where we didn't have enough hours to basically even pay the rent. So we were both working in restaurants. But the weird thing was, you talk to people and say, what do you do? I say, I'm a lecturer at a university, and straight away people have this in their mind. It has incredible kind of social capital, but it wasn't paying the bills. And so that kind of led us to really start thinking about, about work and the future of work, and from the kind of conditions that we're in. And yeah, that always kind of saddled us a bit. The fact that it seemed to be that we were doing well and doing something that we wanted to be doing and we're proud of, and part of your identity, but at the same time, that identity and wasn't enough in a certain sense from a kind of paying the bills.
Totally undermine that kind of sense of, this is who I am, but I'm also incredibly hollow and incredibly poor. I mean, I think that is I think it's a good point, actually. That thing. I said artists, journalists, and lecturers are those categories of job role or kind of vocation, which people still, and I think particularly older generations, still consider to be, because they were once a thing. You could be, I'm an artist, I'm a journalist, I'm an academic. But now that myth should now be totally dispelled.
I think they're imagining you in some 30s golden age, striding across the quadrangle with your mortarboard on.
Exactly, and that's the thing. And so, I mean, I think from our perspective, I'm speaking for both of us here, but like, the sooner those myths are dispelled, the better the conversation around work will be, because those kind of myths which people hold on to, even those who are in those jobs, and to some extent, maybe you have to believe a myth in order to think that your job's a good one. We've all been there, but the sooner that we have those realistic, blunt, very sober conversations around an unromantic idea of work, then we can have conversations about increasing our free time.
Yes, okay. So this seems to be a problem associated with capitalism, then?
Well,
have we seen it anywhere else?
To a large extent, we do make. So the first chapter in the book is really around a little potted history of some of the struggles within capitalism, because obviously in capitalism, it's an economic system whereby there has been a systematic attempt to reduce the opportunities for survival outside of the labour market. That's one definition of capitalism. So we have to earn a living, which is a weird phrase in itself, and if you think about it long enough, we have to engage in some type of selling our labour time, renting ourselves out for a wage. And there have been periods in capitalism where, yes, that does mean that we can accumulate a surplus, buy a house, set our nest up, and have a life which seems quasi-autonomous. There was a particular few decades where that was definitely the case for a certain part of the global population. Ever since then, as to use Carl's phrase from earlier, diminishing returns. Okay, fine. That's capitalism. That's a system which we obviously have to start rethinking for environmental reasons, broadly speaking, but in general, ethical reasons. We are an ethical society. That there are good reasons to actually question that. And we do make the case in the book for an ethical demand for less time in the labour market. Fine. What we also do in the book, which I think is perhaps one of the conversations which we're starting rather than just contributing to, restarting, is a question really for socialists, a question for those who are interested in post-capitalism, those who are interested in new ways of arranging our economic setup, basically. And that question we pose to them is basically, what are you going to do about work and working time? And the reason why we ask that question is because the historically in actually existing socialist societies, we pick on the Soviet Union and figures like Lenin and Trotsky, there's been a replication of some of the exact same practices that were going on in industrial capitalism at the time, under the presupposition, under the idea that this is basically a natural way of working. Industrialism is the best way of working. We can do it almost better than capitalism. We're better at working, we're better at producing than capitalists who just take the profit and there's the elites and so on. Unfortunately and tragically, the Soviet Union replicated the Taylorist, the Fordist system of production because it was seen as the most efficient. Now, what we're questioning, we're using resources from other traditions, more heterodox traditions, more radical Marxist traditions, more radical political traditions, to say, well, actually, for a lot of people under the Soviet Union and other socialist societies who still use this way of working, it still felt a little bit like capitalism. It's still a little bit, actually the day-to-day life of there's many benefits and so on from being a non-capitalist society, but nonetheless, the way that you work, that's a central part of what it is to be in a modern society. And so, drilling down to that question means what we suggest is that we should kind of really lay bare some of what we think work should be like, and for socialists, the question is, what do you want reductions of the working week as other socialists have asked for, or would you rather leave that as a black box that can be sorted out? All we have to do is change the ownership structures. All we have to do is change where the profits go and redistribution. We're saying, actually, let's go into the factory, let's go into the hidden abode itself and ask, actually, maybe in our future, in our post-capitalist future and so on, we should be changing the way that we work fundamentally. I think most people probably wouldn't disagree with that, but unfortunately there's been a historical precedent where there was a lot of agreement between capitalist factory owners and more socialist factory owners.
And we point out in the book as well, so in our chapter where we look at kind of green strategies today, and we look at some of the kind of the Green New Deal. Now this is very much a kind of concept under construction, and there's kind of more social democrat versions of it. There's more kind of socialist versions of it. But what we kind of pick up on and we look at is what is the future of work under a Green New Deal that's proposed, and a lot of the literature and the policy framework is under a jobs guarantee, the idea of guaranteeing a job for everyone, and essentially kind of creating a new kind of industrial revolution. And we saw in, say, Labour's 2019 manifesto, they took a version of it called, they reframed it not as a Green New Deal, but as a Green Industrial Revolution. And again, the point, it's a slight intervention we make in the book is to say, first of all, to point out that, industrialism, or the Industrial Revolution wasn't necessarily a massive win for workers. It was
certainly in the early years, it was atrocious.
Exactly. Poor working conditions, extremely long working hours, huge social deprivation, and it was very much a kind of win for industrialists and capitalists. So the question we're asking is, what would be the New Deal for workers in a Green New Deal? And we just point to the fact that, again, we don't see the kind of working time very often mentioned, and we think it's a kind of a low-hanging fruit that Green New Dealists and green strategies in general should be kind of tapping into, because there's a utopian kind of element to it, that's both kind of realistic, but also that is slightly utopian as well, about reducing the working week and how that can kind of create a kind of sustainable and just society post whatever form of kind of capitalism we live in today.
Right, I've got a question here. It's an interesting one. It's from one of our Zoom attendees. It's basically if we reduce our working week so much, do you think that people would be able to cope? I mean, psychologically, are people going to be able to cope with having that much, which is open space, he said, psychologically? Are we too neurotic to stop working?
Well, it is an interesting question, and again, as we touch on in the book, So John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist who was writing in the 1930s his famous essay on looking at working time, he kind of looked at the huge gains that we'd made throughout the kind of 19th and 20th century, and saw the kind of the massive drop in working time that had happened, and very much kind of predicted that by 2030 we would be working a 15-hour week. And for him, the biggest question was a kind of existential question. It was, what will we do? Like, we're basically, we've solved the economic question, the economic problem, which is to move beyond the realm of necessity. But he saw that as being posing a massive problem to humanity, in the sense of what would we do with our time, because of our kind of, especially the global north, where the Protestant work ethic, our work and our identity has been forged through work. So it is an interesting question. Obviously, we're coming pretty close to 2030 now. It doesn't look likely we're going to have that 15-hour week, and we're not going to actually, for the vast majority of us aren't going to have that experience. But it is an interesting point, and I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think it's one of those ones where sometimes I'm slightly suspicious in a way of thinking, like, if we're thinking about, there probably were some birthing pains, for example, moving from a 6-day week to a 5-day week, where people will say, okay, well, Sunday was for, when it was for prayer or rest, and now I've got a Saturday. What the hell am I going to do with my Saturday? But ultimately, that, as far as I'm aware, that culture's kind of subsided. Whatever birthing pains there were, I'm not sure anyone's, I think there are probably a fair few people who are like, what am I going to do this Saturday? Nonetheless, I think if you said to people, actually, we think we have too much free time, we're now going to go to a 6-day week with the same pay, people will be, well, that's my free time we're talking about here. So I think there's often a question of, fine, if we short circuit to a 2-day week, that's a pretty hard, that's quite a large intervention into our general working culture and practice. But if we move to a 4-day week, or even, in France have a 35-hour week, many countries, Denmark and Germany work generally a bit less than us. We're talking about transitions here, then I think it's much less of an existential shock. Keynes, what's interesting about Keynes in a way is that he was talking about a working week, he's right in 1930, I think, 1929 maybe, just after the financial crash, the Wall Street crash. He's jumping ahead thinking about 15-hour week, and he's obviously doing that thought experiment himself. If he'd thought about it in terms of a multi-decade-long transition period, he was a great believer great full of Aristotle and Plato. He thought about the good life, leading the good life. That's what was interested in shorter working hours, and he thought, okay, look, we should start posing these more philosophical questions again. I think he might have come to different conclusions if he actually was thinking through the process of moving towards a 15-hour week, rather than let's think about, okay, 44 hours down to 15. So I think there's often a question of that question. I think, and the reason why I get suspicious is often, there's sometimes studies saying, oh, we can't have too much free time, and I'm always a bit like, whose side are you on? I think about, it's almost a symptom of thinking like, well, actually, we need to be productive. There's often you get these studies that we need to be productive, and we're unhappy when we're not productive. And it's like, I'm not sure. Before we had a system where we literally had to produce value the whole time. I'm not sure many people were saying, we need to be productive, be more productive.
Well, that's also what I was going to say, actually. People who have these polls and Keynes, perhaps if they had found out about your 15-hour-a-week hunter-gatherers, they wouldn't have been so worried about this.
I think, just the last point on this as well. I think there's a really great study to be done in terms of actually engaging with people who don't no longer work, i.e. pensioners, people who have decent pension, who don't have to sell their labour anymore, to actually engage and ask them these questions in terms of how did they find it, and in the sense of like their identity was always associated with whatever maybe profession they had, and we'd be able to, it already exists in a certain sense for a certain part of the population, So yeah, I think there's an interesting kind of engagement to be done there.
And there's another one here, which is that talking about the interventions that you're suggesting, saying that if they are not practiced, then actually there may be a bigger hazard than we see now, which is it seems that work is bifurcating into very low paid, in fact not low enough to live on, and then but very high paid but high pressured work. So I guess in 100 years' time there will still be a QC who had to do 60 or 70 hours a week to get through training. But there'll kind of be no common ground between those people. There'll be, sort of underpaid functionaries and people doing exciting careers.
I mean, this is something which Andre Gors, who's a thinker we both look up to, he called the dual society. This is something which we like. He's writing about this stuff in the 1970s, 1980s, and actually you can see a lot of this come to fruition today. What some authors today are calling the servant economy. Lots of people serving the needs of which hitherto didn't really exist of those who have disposable cash, basically, and those two jobs being this dystopia of let's say the servants and those who can make use of the servants, let's say, to put it in a really grim way. I think one caveat which I think we should both put out there right away is that obviously we don't think the shorter working week is a silver bullet for all of the woes of the labour market. We think it is a multi-dividend policy, which we do make the case for in the book: gender equality, environment, freedom, and so on. But we don't think, for example, the shorter working week obviously can deal with like chronic low pay or the abuse of dodgy contracts, things like that. There are various reforms that need to happen, not least the repeal of many anti-trade union laws, for example, before we have a really strong, robust labour market. That's absolutely the case. So I think it's really important to raise these questions because it shows that actually the shorter work, what the limits are of a shorter working week. That's as a policy, but it doesn't mean that nonetheless the shorter working week shouldn't be part of the repertoire of how to improve the labour market. Basically, that's my line on that.
Yeah.
Did you have a question? Just one second. There's the microphone. We have a question from the floor.
I was curious to know how you'd see it working in different sectors. Wouldn't the white-collar sector have... I mean, you might know the book Bullshit Jobs, yeah? So I suspect the white-collar professional middle classes could move to a shorter working week like that. In fact, I suspect many of them do less than 30 hours a week, let alone 35, more like 25 possibly, because they're surfing the net, they're going shopping. And one of the things about the epidemic is it's shown that those people now have a completely different life. So how do you equalize it for those people in manufacturing, in shops, in public services, in public transport, who are tied to their workplace pretty much because of the hours they have to work based upon the services that they're providing?
Do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, initial thought here is I guess there's absolutely different strategies for different sectors. I guess the one point I want to make straight away is that those who won the 5-day week, first of all, were those who worked in construction and mining. So it wasn't white-collar workers who initially moved to the 5-day week. It was strong labour unions in quite traditional sectors. So in some ways, your question relates to power, basically, in the labour market. So those, for example, with, let's say, white-collar workers with lots of scarce skills and so on, have a lot more bargaining power than those who are much more disposable, and therefore, yes, the question of power comes into it in terms of if loads of Amazon workers want to look for a 4-day week, the employer can effectively try and just basically get rid of them. They've already made them fairly disposable via their contracts anyway. So it does come down to the push and shove of workers in the labour market nonetheless. We shouldn't just think of those who are moving to shorter working weeks as white-collar workers, though. So, for example, the Communication Workers Union, who represent posties, they're the trade union in England who've in recent years successfully reduced the working week by 4 hours in the last over a set period of years. They're going to keep doing that. So, as well as yes, you're right. There are many, and a lot of the firms that we've worked with have been quite cushy, decent employment conditions, and the employer's been quite amenable to this, we shouldn't assume that that's always been the case, or that necessarily is the case today. The final thing I'll say, and I hope I'm not taking your point, Carl, here, is basically to say that when we consider the shorter working week, we shouldn't just assume it's about moving current workers to shorter working hours without creating new employment. For example, in the public sector, nurses, teaching and so on, you simply can't cram your 5 days into 4. You need to create new jobs. And so in that sense, it's not just about shifting those that already can do it, just do it. That's great, crack on. But in many industries, we should be asking for greater job creation. Employers with huge profit margins should be taking on someone that's, creating more jobs for the population, really. So the public sector is a good place to start. So I think that's an important point to make, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you did. But yeah, just the final bit I would add to it is, I think we should recognise that a lot of white-collar computer work is very malleable and can be reorganised in a certain way in which you can get big productivity gains. Because also as well, we have to look at the type of work it is. It's more kind of task-orientated work, and so more kind of public-facing or customer-facing work does create certain problems, especially in the public sector. If you have to offer a service 7 days a week, the idea that you could just, suddenly go to, say, a 4-day week overnight, obviously would, be problematic, and you point to maybe in certain sectors where there's labour shortage and stuff as well. But I think the point that Will and myself tried to make, and when we've worked with different companies, who have different workforces, is not to get hung up on, say, the 4-day week. It is about reducing the working week, and nearly in all cases there's a way of creating different rotas, creating different patterns of work where you can still shorten the working week, and that might be more beneficial to work that they might not necessarily want, say, a 4-day week. They might want shorter hours in order to go and pick up the kids from school. There's lots of different things that people want. The important thing is to think about how you can reduce it rather than necessarily getting hung up on the idea of a 4-day week, because that might not be accessible to all, maybe.
So this has been interesting, really. Over the course of an hour, we've discussed that the situation we're in now isn't automatic. It isn't part of the background. It has been created due to power and history, and that we find ourselves in a certain situation. It's not necessarily a good one, that it can probably be altered without the world imploding, without the economy or capitalism imploding, but with people being able to think about what's better for their lives and to get more out of their lives and their families and just lead a more fulfilling existence.
I mean, you put it like that, sounds quite nice.
It really does.
I think the thing is, there is at the heart of it is an ethic. At the heart of it, I mean, we do make the case for this, that there is a question of freedom as well. And I think maybe in one way, the question about working time is a question about the purpose of the economy, which is the Keynesian question as well. So putting the question of what's the purpose of the economy, what's it good for, let's say, is really what the conversation around working time is about. Because the classic, we at the moment we live to work, instead we should be working to live. And at moments we feel like we're doing that. Maybe when you get a pay rise, or you're on your holiday, 2 weeks into your holiday, your annual leave, maybe you feel like, oh look, life's not so bad because I've worked and now I have time off. The question about working time is to working time reduction, the 4-day week is to continue that march. Otherwise, we'll be on the losing end of working time increases.
So let's start thinking about stop putting the cart before the horse. The book is coming out tomorrow. The book is Overtime, and that is by Kyle Lewis and Will Stronge. Thank you ever so much for joining us today, both in person and on Zoom. I'd like to say thank you to Jeff Wood, Scott Davey, Joe Atari, and Jem Precious, because I appear in front of the camera, but they all work very hard behind it. Thank you very much, and join us for the next one. Bye-bye.